Well, welcome to our backyard. This past spring, my wife announced that she really wanted to up our garden game this year. Last year we had a garden, but it was mostly just kind of rows in the ground, and she wanted raised beds and some more sprinklers, and really wanted to be able to produce a whole bunch more. And I went along, though. I mean, I must confess, I really never really understood gardening. I know it's something that she enjoys, but I once had a friend, refer to these as $10 tomatoes, because if you add up how much time and energy and effort you put into growing one, that's probably about what it cost you. And that always seemed really inefficient to me. It's like, why not just go to the store and get what you need while you need it? But I try to be a good husband, and so went along, and so we built this big bed, and we filled it full of dirt and wheelbarrow load after wheelbarrow load, and then installed the sprinklers, and then eventually planted these really kind of small little plants, and they actually looked kind of comical. Here they were, just a dozen or so of these small little plants in this big old planter, and I thought to myself, well, I guess we'll see how that works. It worked pretty well, and in fact now we have this kind of mildly overgrown garden that requires tending, and then we come out here and we've actually extracted quite a bit of, especially the tomatoes, out of it, that have somewhat stretched my culinary skills to find uses for all of them, but that's been part of the fun too. Somewhere over the summer, while we were, tending, and I was out here in the beginning, begrudgingly, I will confess, helping out, it did start to dawn on me, maybe what this is for, because I still don't think it's the most efficient way necessarily to procure food, at least not the way that we do it. I'm sure some of you out there have more efficient means than we tend to have, but it really is about something else. There's almost like this feeling that you get when you're out here harvesting all of these $10 tomatoes. There's a feeling of almost pride, and frankly of awe, and I sometimes forget, but when I do think back to what we started with, and how simple and basic it all seemed, the fact that you end up over the course of only a few months with all of this, it's almost like magic. And I remember being out here with my daughter, harvesting some, and we kind of put our hand deep inside there and found a whole other nest with dozens more tomatoes that we couldn't see from the beginning. And she explained, "Dad, where are all these coming from?" And I'm like, well, they're coming from the soil, they're coming from the ground, they're coming from the air, they're coming from the water that we give it. And she was like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." Yeah, it's pretty cool. Somewhere there's a source of life that these plants are drawing from to then provide something for all of us to eat that becomes a source of life for us. If you think about it really at all, it kind of is miraculous. Now, the scripture we read for today is one of Paul's letters, and it's one of Paul's letters that he wrote in prison. And I always find it interesting that sometimes the most uplifting letters that we have, and some of the most life-giving passages we have from Paul, are ones he wrote from prison. But this was one of them. Now, Paul usually writes in a sort of matter-of-fact style, and if you read kind of the section before the section we read today, you'll see that. It's written really kind of like a letter in sort of a conversational style. And after this section, Paul is writing, goes back to writing in sort of a conversational style. This section actually sort of stands out, and if you read it in the original Greek, which most of us don't, it really stands out. And our best guess is what Paul is doing here is he's actually quoting, and he's probably quoting an early Christian him, because he's really diving into something important here. There's a lot of conversation and some conflict happening in the community that Paul's writing to, and like we talked about before, they're arguing a little bit with themselves about what beliefs that they have from their previous religious experience. What of those beliefs can be brought forward into this new religious experience they're a part of? What needs to be let go of? And so this letter is actually about Paul dealing with a lot of that stuff. And he's doing it in the way that Paul does. And Paul likes to make arguments. And honestly, I imagine Paul must have been a really great debater. Sometimes a lot of his writings actually reads more like him debating somebody or something than anything else. But right in the middle of it, we get a hymn. And I think the reason we get that is that as useful as words are, and as useful as facts and ideas and thoughts are, sometimes you need something more. Because sometimes what you're appealing to isn't just a thought or an idea. What you're appealing to is more of a feeling, is more of a way of being. And Paul seems to understand what many of us understand, which is the best way to communicate a feeling and a way of being may not be with just basic words on paper. But there's something about a hymn, there's something about song, there's something about verse, there's something about prose, that can communicate these ideas, that can communicate feelings and ways of being better than anything else. And so Paul resorts to that here to remind people of some important and important truth about God and Christ. Now, the reason that Paul has to do this is one of the debates taking place is around what we would probably contemporarily call astrology. And while the idea of astrology and the stars and reading the stars may seem like a quaint idea to us now, it was very serious business in the time that Paul is writing. And if you think about it, it kind of makes some sense. I mean, after all, we know now what stars are, right? There are suns like ours, maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller, that are far, far away, that we just catch this little glimpse of. And we know why they move, or at least they appear to move, is because some of them are actually planets that are moving. Some of them aren't really moving. It's because we're moving on our planet. We know all of that. They didn't know any of that 2,000 years ago. All they knew is there were these miraculous lights in the sky that kind of twinkled a little bit. They didn't know that was because of the atmosphere. And they moved, and nobody really understood what they were or how they came to be there. And so people over time just naturally started to think up theories as to what they might be for. And they would notice, these stars were in this place when this thing happened, so these stars must control the harvest, and all that sort of stuff. And it's somewhat, I think at least a little understandable how they got to where they got. And so they have this long-standing, and one of these communities has this long-standing understanding of the stars in this way. And so Paul needs to write to them and say, look. It's not about that. It's not about the positioning of the stars and all this sort of stuff. But there is something. There is something that permeates the universe. There is something that is as big and on the level of all the stars in the sky. There is something that is that, and that thing that is that we know and understand as God. But that God isn't just something far away that can be barely seen and never touched like the stars. That God is actually known to us in another way. God is known to us through the person of Christ, meaning God is both able to be out there and big and permeating the universe, and God is able to be close and intimate and as near to us as we are to each other. Paul wants them to understand that the source of life, the source of all things, isn't far away and distant. The source of life is close and has a sense of closeness to it. That is the feeling he's trying to help them understand. And it's the feeling that you get when you step out to your garden and you take your $10 tomato off the vine and you walk it inside and you wash it off and you turn it into something delicious. You are so close, right there, to the source of life. And what Paul wants us to understand is that it's the same with God. We are so close to the source of all of the life around us if we choose to see it. And Paul doesn't want the people back then distracted by ideas about, which, where's the Big Dipper and what's that go, where's it going and what does it have to do with me? Paul's like, no, that's not what it's about. You don't need to worry about all that stuff. God is as close as you and me. Now, we've obviously been talking about being the church throughout all of this time. And of course, bees are really important. They're really important to things like gardens, right? One of the things that we are reminded of all the time is that, without bees, so much of the food that we eat, we would not have. We are dependent on those bees to help bring all of the amazing life and bounty that we have around us. And if you remember when we talked about worker bees, one of the amazing facts, at least I thought was one of the most amazing facts, and really as far as I'm concerned, like the fact of this whole series, was this idea that in the winter the worker bees surround the queen and bat their little wings to generate heat to keep them and everybody else warm, and they take turns cycling out, from the outer side. If you remember, we talked about all that. That's amazing. But what we didn't really talk about when we talked about that was also what's at the center of it. What are they all swarming around? We're swarming around the queen. Well, why? Because the queen for the hive is the source of life, right? The queen is the one who fertilizes all the little bees, right? Without the queen, there is no bee. There are no bees. Without the queen, there is no bees, there is no hive, there is no honey, there's no pollinating, there's no plants, there's no food. The queen is the source of life for the hive. And so, of course, they place it at the center of what they do. It's no different with us as people of faith. We have a choice, but we do have a choice about what we place at the center of our lives, what we place at the center of what it is that we do. Well, what should that be? Well, it seems fairly obvious to me. What is at the center of what it is, who we are, and what is at the center of who and our lives as a church is God and is Christ. Because that is the source of the life that we all partake in. So what does it mean to put God at the center of our lives? What does it mean to put Christ at the center of our lives? Well, it means following what Christ told us to follow. It means acting in the way that Christ asks us to act, and about taking those opportunities where we are able to make sure that we are staying close to what God is doing. Now, in the passage too, Paul is clear, and the hymn that he's quoting is clear that God is vast, right? I mean, he does place God on the order of the stars, vast and universal, and yet also personal, which means this great thing for us. It means that we can find God almost anywhere. And I think now more than ever, we need to be reminded of that, because many of us, myself included, have just been, trained over the years to expect God in certain places. We expect God sitting in our pew. We expect God singing certain songs. We expect God, on the mountaintop. When we're out in nature, we try to train ourselves to expect God in certain places. But the truth is, we can find God in all sorts of places. In fact, we can find God in all of the places if we're willing to look. Maybe even in our backyard when we're picking our tomatoes. If we just take a minute to marvel at all of the seemingly impossible things that have to happen to make this possible. And you don't even need to step out in your garden for that. It may just be in the produce aisle at the local grocery store or wherever it is. Anytime we take a minute to take a step back and count the blessings of what is happening in our lives, and just even begin to, even for a moment, think about all of the things that have to happen in order for that one thing to be possible for us right now. And realize if we think about it too much, sometimes we can feel like, oh my God, it just seems so impossible. How does this ever work? How do we ever get tomatoes? The process of arriving at this point seems so crazy. How do you take soil and water and sunlight and turn it into this? How is that even possible? Because as our scripture reminds us, with God, all things are possible. So, what is at the center of our lives? Is at the center of our lives our quest to serve, to love God, love neighbor, and love self? That phrase we just keep coming back to because it is just that important. Or have some of us, myself included, managed to allow other things, to other priorities to creep in? And how do we even know? Well, I think the best way that we know is to just think about our day and think about how we are seeing and interacting with the world. Are we out here taking things like this tomato for granted, just assuming that we earned it or we deserve it? Or are we taking a minute to understand the crazy number of miracles that have to take place in order for this to be delivered to us? Are we grateful for the blessings that have been placed in our lives, or are we concentrating only on the things that we don't have? Are we concentrating so much on how we would like things to be and how we think things would be so much better if only, that we're missing all of the good that is in our lives right here and right now? I think if God is at the center of our lives, if that amazing idea that God is both anywhere and everywhere, but God is also as close as you and I, that if that is at the center of our lives, we can't help but look around and see the good. And we can't help but be grateful for the good that we find in whatever form. So may we as the church, and may you as a person of faith, always strive to remember who our Queen Bee is. Remember what is at the center of our lives and our center of our community, and who it is that we are called to be, and how it is that we are called to be. We are the people of God. We are God's beloved children, and we have been given all of the life that we need. Amen.